The controversy over land and copper in southern Arizona.
We are watching a collision between those two values that are intrinsic to our very being.
A push to reform the criminal justice system.
And what the data shows is that putting more and more people in prison, especially for nonviolent crimes, does not make our communities safer.
What trees tell scientists about winter rain and summer wildfires.
We didn't expect the relationship between winter precipitation and then fire in the following season to disappear like that.
Hello and welcome to Arizona 360. I'm Lorraine Rivera. Thank you for joining us. The reality of southern Arizona being home to a new open-pit copper mine is becoming more likely. This month, HudBay Minerals announced it's received key permits to begin work on the proposed mine in the Santa Rita mountain range southeast of Tucson. It's been a long time coming for those who support the project and those who don't. The proposed open-pit mine has been at issue for more than a decade. Here's a brief look back. In 2005, Augusta Resource Corporation, a Canadian company, purchased the land in the Santa Rita mountain range. The company later merged with HudBay Minerals. In 2007, the company released the mining plan of operation. A year later came the environmental impact statement. There are a number of state and federal agencies involved in the permitting process. The primary decision makers are the Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. This month, two of those agencies granted key permits, essentially giving Rosemont Copper the green light. However, lawsuits may cause additional delays. Here in southern Arizona, one longtime reporter has covered the mining project extensively. Our crew recently visited Tony Davis in the newsroom at the Arizona Daily Star. He began by explaining that the American Smelting and Refining Company, better known as ASARCO, owned the land up until the 90s and then sold it for millions.
They said it was partly because of the economic state of the industry, but of course all the environmentalists said it was because we opposed it so much. And that's really hard to say because the current proposal has gotten even more opposition than the last one, and nobody's ever pulled out.
What's there that HudBay Minerals would like?
Well, it's called a world-class copper deposit, and a lot of people have said that. A lot of analysts in the mining industry, and there's the analyst in Canada who followed both HudBay Minerals, the current owner, and Augusta Resource, the previous owner. They said it was a world-class copper deposit.
The mile-wide, half-mile-deep open-pit copper mine would occupy about 4,000 acres in the Santa Rita mountain range and function for an estimated 19 years. Beneath the surface, this site is estimated to house some 7 billion pounds of copper. Its yearly extraction is sought after on a global scale.
112,000 tons of copper concentrate. That's what's delivered to market. That's what's shipped to China, shipped to India, shipped to other parts of the U.S.
It can't be smelted here in the U.S.
Well, there isn't enough smelter capacity in the U.S. to handle another big mine.
There are a number of issues causing delays, including jaguar and ocelot sightings, tribal lands, and water.
The biggest concern, and that is still being debated and discussed to this day, is whether to dig out the open pit, they're going to have to dewater the aquifer down to 2,900 feet, I believe, deep. And the question is, what impacts is that going to have on the streams downstream, Davidson Canyon and Cienega Creek, which the EPA calls aquatic resources of national importance. You know, you have one set of studies and scientists and computer models that says the impacts are going to be delayed for hundreds of years if they ever happen, you know, and that's the Forest Service's position. The EPA and the BLM scientists took a much different position, that whenever the impacts happen, they could be quite significant. And this controversy is the number one thing that's going to be played out in the courts.
This mine has been in motion for a decade. An estimated $1.9 billion project, HudBay Minerals is committed to this site.
They had the resources. They've got several mines in Canada. They have had a couple in Latin America, Guatemala and Peru. So they have the resources. They have the financial staying power to go through all the ins and outs of permitting. In terms of government bureaucracy, it has been a war inside the bureaucracy. You've had scientists within the agencies arguing, you've had one agency arguing with another. Yeah, I'd say the bureaucracy, the struggle over this within the bureaucracy is somewhat legendary at this point. I have never seen anything like this. And I've been a reporter for almost 45 years.
And this current controversy may be rooted in unresolved history.
This particular project was not inevitable. Pima County had a chance to buy the property in 2005. The owner at the time was a man named Yoram Levy, and he was offering it for $11 million to the county. And he had just paid $4 million for it from Asarco 7 months earlier. A few months after the county didn't buy it, Augusta Resources put down $20 million. And if the county had bought it, it would have been preserved and there would have been no mine, for better or worse, you know.
You take opinion and emotion out of this controversy. Based on what you've reported on, everything happening as it should.
You know, I hate to have to punt on this, but that's going to be decided by the judges, okay? I mean, it depends on who you talk to and whose side you're on. If you're on the side of the mining company, you're going to say, yes, everything is happening as it should, except that it took too long. You know, this should have been settled 3 years ago or 5 years ago. If you're on the side of the opposition, you're going to say that, you know, Trump has politicized everything, and, you know, under Obama or Clinton, this thing could have been killed by the Corps of Engineers, because the Corps of Engineers district office out of Los Angeles recommended against it in 2016. You know, on the other hand, you could say that the people now are taking a more careful look. They've reviewed all the findings and they've come up with different conclusions, and that does happen in government. So I hate to say, but it depends on who you talk to.
You're the reporter who's covered this issue the most. You know it the best. So tell me what you think is most important for the viewers and for the readers to understand about this project.
I guess there's two things. Tucson is a mining town, okay? It's been tied to copper mining for decades, if not longer. There used to be 4 copper mines surrounding out in the south of Tucson, and it's now down to 2. There were mergers, closures, etc. But when I lived here in the 80s, there were 4 copper mines, you know. But Tucson is also a town that loves the outdoors and values wildlife and values the desert. And so the most important thing here is we are watching a collision between those two values that are intrinsic to our very being.
HudBay Minerals declined our request for an on-camera interview. However, Rick Grinnell, the Southern Arizona Business Coalition, agreed to speak with us in support of the project and what it means for the future of Southern Arizona and copper production around the world.
About 90% of this pit itself is on private property. So the U.S. Forest Service land being used for the excess rock is going to be on Forest Service land. That's why we go through the whole environmental impact process. Keep in mind, we still import copper into this country now. We used to be a net exporter. We are now a net importer. The population has grown 3 times since 1950 to 7.7 billion people. The need for copper has grown 9 times. And over the course of the next 10 years, the population increase, it's going to become much more important to have copper. And also be able to have our own sustainability and the ability to use our own copper. It's great to have international business, but you also have to protect your backyard when it comes to economic development. You have to make sure you have the resources and utilize them the best possible way in order to facilitate the need of the American people.
A moment ago you said backyard, and I can imagine the people who are watching this will say, what about our backyard when it comes to the air pollution, the water resources? Who's really going to be the gatekeeper of ensuring that HudBay honors what it says it's going to do for this community and for that mountain range?
The U.S. Forest Service, the Corps of Engineers, the Environmental Protection Agency. There is an accountability process that goes on with this. It's not like they can just go in and all of a sudden they got their toys and then go play. This is not the way it works anymore. There is a follow-up, there is a requirement by law to ensure that they do what they say they're going to do. If in fact they do not, then there's a cease and desist.
Yeah.
And it's very succinct and it's very real. It's taken 12 years to get to this point.
This is a $1.9 billion project. How does that translate for the region's economy when it's all said and done as far as jobs are concerned?
Well, according to the ASU Economic Impact Study, $350 million for over the 19-year period of new tax revenue. 500 quality, $60,000 plus, including benefits. About 2,500 jobs in construction industry to build this, plus all the vendors. As much as possible, Rosemont has committed to buying locally, period. Now, there's certain things we don't produce here in southern Arizona. Big equipment, there's certain expertise that need to come in and be part of the engineering and the build out and everything else. But as much as possible, they're going to spend local. And I appreciate the people, the aesthetics of the pit. But that's why they're going to build the pit from the outside in. And that allows to set up a sort of a buffer zone, a barrier that will, people don't have to look deep inside. But you know what the irony is? People are going to come here because they want to see this.
It's estimated 70,000 people visit Arizona every year to see mines. To get this one up and running, there have been at least 1,000 studies on behalf of more than a dozen government agencies and about 43,000 public comments filed. HudBay Minerals says it has spent more than $100 million on permits.
The Forest Service listened, the Corps of Engineers listened, the EPA listened. Everybody's listening, contrary to what they want to tell you. And I don't like the political arguments that keep going around with this topic. It's not necessary.
If it's approved, what does it mean for Arizona?
It's a solid, sustainable economic engine. It keeps people employed. And when you have a better economy, the overall attitude of an environment, of the community is better. When people can afford to take their kids to do stuff and maybe take a vacation or go to school and get the other things that they need, it affords opportunities that many industries, particularly in southern Arizona, don't afford.
What do people need to know about the need for copper right now?
Well, we can't live without it. There is not just copper, but the mining, the products that come out of the ground are used in everyday life. There is nothing any longer that we do, including the bringing for agriculture. You need the equipment to get enough agriculture to do all the things. Everything that is done today has a facet of it where mining is attached. I challenge I wouldn't mind losing my phone for a week, but other than that, people would rather lose their wallet than lose their phone. We can't afford to live without it. That's the real fact.
Okay, Rick Grinnell from the Southern Arizona Business Coalition, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
A number of people and organizations oppose Rosemont Copper's plans. This week, another lawsuit was filed in federal court to try and stop the mine from operating, bringing the total number of suits to 4. Save the Scenic Santa Ritas was one of the first groups to contest the mine. Among their concerns, water, air pollution, and wildlife. Gail Hartman from Save the Scenic Santa Ritas begins the interview with some background on the litigation surrounding the project and explained the Army Corps of Engineers is targeted in their latest lawsuit.
It's very odd because their own Los Angeles office recommended denial of that permit, and then their San Francisco office, after thinking about it for a couple of years, went ahead and granted it in an amazing flip-flop, which I don't think is going to hold up well for them in the future. But after that happened, then the Forest Service and HudBay, the company, had to agree on a bonding agreement, which is totally inadequate, but they have agreed on it, and on the final mining plan of operation. That has happened. So basically the mine could go ahead. HudBay has said that they will not do anything for at least a month, which all the lawyers have agreed on that. I mean, this mine really would be a regional disaster, and it would go on forever. The disaster isn't just going to go away in a few years. And the Santa Ritas and we all deserve better than this. It would take some of our drinking water, it would both deplete water and pollute water, and there's just no question about that. And we just can't afford that sort of loss to our water resources.
One of the things that HudBay has said is that this will be a cleaner mine, and with things like dry stack tailings that will reduce water consumption, the Tier 4 diesel, which will reduce emissions. Any of that make this palatable for you?
I think that's really just, I think as we said in our op-ed, sort of moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic. It means very, very little in the long term. You know, you have a huge pit, mile wide, half mile deep, 5,000 acres of public land, Coronado National Forest, buried under 700 or 800 feet of tailings and waste piles. All kinds of infrastructure, buildings, stacks, roads, you know, power lines, trucks going 24 hours a day, probably about one every 15 minutes up and down Highway 83, a too narrow two-lane road that is not equipped for that sort of thing. Explosions, I'm sure all the people who live nearby are going to be looking forward to that. Probably the local wells of people who live nearby will be depleted. This is not going to be a fun thing or something we can look forward to.
Here in the U.S., it would be, there are people who would oversee it, government agencies that would oversee it. If it doesn't happen here, concerns about it going to other places with fewer regulations.
Well, first, I would have to say that I don't think anybody is seriously going to be overseeing it. If it were to start, it would be like really any other mine, Morenci or anything that we're all familiar with. As to the other part of the question, there are several existing copper mines in southern Arizona. They're not working at capacity. So there's plenty of copper to be had. And secondly, I think we really need to look at this in the long term. We have to learn to reduce our impact on the world, on the earth. We have to use less copper. We have to, not throw away our cell phones so quickly. Whatever it is, the earth is not going to keep giving us resources, and we simply have to do better.
Jaguar, the ocelots that we've had in this mountain range, when's the last time there have been reported sightings?
Ocelots, I believe, live there now, also in the Huachucas. I think the last jaguar has been gone for about a year. I think he went home to Sonora to find a lady friend. But what it's showing us is that because of climate change, these subtropical animals are moving north. And if we don't have a wall to stop them, unfortunately there is not much to stop them in the Patagonia Mountains, which are just south of the Santa Ritas, those animals are finding a place to live in southern Arizona.
Lawsuit filed this week, potentially more coming. How likely is it that you and your organizations will continue to fight this?
Well, we're definitely going to fight it as long as necessary. We are waiting for the local judge, the federal judge, to schedule oral arguments on the lawsuit we filed many months ago. And as I said, we just filed a second one against the Army today, and we'll see how that goes. This is such an egregious mistake that it seems to us that the courts, if they have any common sense, that they will look at this very closely and at least send it back to the drawing boards and quite likely simply tell the Army that this was a mistake.
Do you believe that federal state agencies haven't done their due diligence in getting to this point and looking at these permits?
Well, that's a kind of a difficult question. They did for quite a while, we think, but in the last couple of years, there's been clearly a big change in the way both the EPA and the Army have addressed things. So that, I hate to say this, but politics has kind of overwhelmed facts. And I think that's why we're in this position right now.
Okay, Gail Hartman from Save the Scenic Santa Ritas, thank you.
Thank you very much.
The Arizona legislative session is winding down at the state capitol in Phoenix. The last week of March is usually the last time for bills to be heard. And there's one topic that lobbyists have tried unsuccessfully to get before lawmakers. It's an effort to change the criminal justice system. For.us is a bipartisan political advocacy group that polled nearly 1,000 Arizonans and found that the vast majority want to see some type of criminal justice reform. Here's Emily Levette, a state policy manager for the organization.
Our goal in terms of the ideal criminal justice system is one that shrinks the size and scope of the prison system here in the United States and sort of reunites more families.
Arizona has heard about criminal justice reform, especially in the last few years, but it's not really made any headway when it comes to conversations at the Capitol. Yeah. Why is that?
I think it is not for lack of support and excitement. This session, we at Forward were tracking like 6 bills, 6 really smart, robust criminal justice reform bills. Those bills were all sponsored by Republicans. They all had a ton of support in the Republican caucus and the Democratic caucus. We did polling, which showed a ton of support for those types of reforms, right? So it's not a matter of support. Where we're getting blocked is that there are a few powerful members of the legislature who are sort of unwilling to have this conversation. And as long as they're in those positions, it's going to be really hard to see the change that most Arizonans want.
When we talk about reform, what avenues are you really exploring?
We at Forward take a really data-driven perspective. So what we do is sort of look at all the data about sort of who is coming into prison in Arizona and how long they're staying, and seeing where Arizona is an outlier from the rest of the country. So what we see in Arizona is two basic reasons that Arizona is an outlier. The first reason is drug crimes. A ton of people go to prison for nonviolent drug and property crimes in Arizona. And since 2000, the number of people who have entered prison, so been admitted to prison for nonviolent drug and property crimes, has grown by 80%. So that's sort of number one. We really want to have a conversation about how do we best address people with drug addiction in Arizona. The second sort of big reason that Arizona is an outlier is how long people spend in prison. So we did an analysis where we looked at prison lengths in Arizona versus the rest of the nation. And what you see is that people stay behind bars in prison in Arizona far longer than other states. So for drug offenses, people stay behind bars for about 40% longer in Arizona than they do in the national average. For property, it's about twice as long.
These are perhaps nonviolent crimes, but there are victims associated with,
of course, yeah,
some of these drug crimes. Is that perhaps one of the hang-ups?
I've worked in a lot of other states on similar issues, and I think what a lot of victims want out of the system is to be restored, right? They want to have their property back if it was stolen. If there's some type of injury, they want to have that back, right? And what we see is that sending a person away to prison for a long period of time does actually very little to restore that victim and to make sure that they get their money back or whatever they need to sort of get back on their feet again.
Arizona has long had a reputation for being a very conservative state, but there are other conservative states that you've worked with, you've explored, and they've come around to this idea.
Arizona is the fourth highest imprisoner in the nation. The top three, the three before Arizona, are Oklahoma, Louisiana, Mississippi. I've had the opportunity to work in all of those states. And what sort of began a conversation about reform in all of those states, and they all have passed pretty comprehensive criminal justice reform packages in the last 5 years, is a look at the data and a look at the research. And what the data shows is that putting more and more people in prison, especially for nonviolent crimes, does not make our community safer. What they did is they sort of started with that evidence and started with that data and built a really robust, smart package from there. And that's what I'm hoping we can do next session in Arizona.
What's the cost of all this?
Yeah, there's the cost to the state. So Arizona taxpayers pay $1.1 billion on prisons each year. But I think in some ways that's an underestimation, because that doesn't account for the cost to a family if a parent is incarcerated, or the cost to a parent if a child is incarcerated. Those are much, much harder to calculate.
What's the ultimate goal here? it's not just to get people out of prison, get them back started, but there's got to be some societal impact that you foresee.
Right now, Arizona is spending more than $1 billion on prisons, right? If you had fewer nonviolent drug and property offenders in prison, what would you do with that money?
What can trees tell us about winter rains and summer wildfires? Well, plenty. That's according to Valerie Trouet, a tree ring scientist at the University of Arizona who studied the issue in California. In our studio, she explained the similarities to Arizona.
So some of the reasons why there's a disconnect between winter precipitation and wildfire nowadays in California are that we're dealing with rising temperatures, hotter summers, hotter droughts, more severe droughts. And at the same time, we're dealing with a lot of fuels because of a century of forest fire management where we've been putting out fires, and so we've been creating a lot of fuels. And those same conditions are also going on in Arizona. That's not only in California. So Arizona is also dealing with hotter temperatures and with more fuels.
Tell us what your research explained to you about your findings in California.
Yeah, so we use tree rings, I'm a tree ring scientist, to look at the climate of the past and at wildfires of the past in California. And what we found is that prior to the 20th century, the two were linked. When there would be a wet summer in California, you'd be pretty well guaranteed that it wouldn't be a big fire year. And vice versa, the big fire years happened after very dry winters. Now what we see is that since the start of the 20th century, that connection between a dry winter and a big fire year has weakened to the extent that even since about the 1980s, there's no connection between the two anymore. So nowadays you can get a very wet winter and it could still be a big fire year. So for instance, the winter of 2016-2017 was a wet winter in California, but then we got the Tubbs fire and the Thomas fire, some very destructive fires regardless.
Here in Arizona, we had a pretty wet spring. Many of us were excited about the snow and that consistent rainfall that we had for several days. Does that at all make any sort of impact on the summer we're about to experience?
So there's some more differences with, between Arizona and California. One of them is we also have the summer monsoon. California doesn't have a summer monsoon. So the summer monsoon, when it comes, it can shorten the fire season because it brings moisture. So we're a little less dependent on winter moisture alone versus California. But also here in Arizona, we see that the link between winter moisture, like a wet winter we just got now, and forest fires in the following spring is not necessarily a very strong link. It could go either way. So our wet winter that we've had now is no guarantee that we're going to have a light fire season in the forests.
But does the precipitation we just experienced then create more vegetation for the summer?
Really good point, Lorraine. So there we're dealing with a little different situation in the forests versus the grasslands. So wet conditions like we just had, they create more fuel in grasslands, so more fine fuel. You get immediate response, you get more grasses, and that creates more fuel and a higher fire risk. In the forest, the link is less direct because it takes more water, it takes longer for the heavier fuel to react.
What would you say was perhaps most telling to you about your research, or perhaps something that you didn't quite expect? I know many times when researchers are approaching an idea, that they have a feeling of they know where it's about to lead. Yeah, so we didn't expect the relationship between winter precipitation and then fire in the following season to disappear like that. We had an idea that it would get weaker, but not that it would just disappear. And that's a frightening idea, actually. That's all for now. Thanks for joining us. Be sure to visit us on social media and let us know what you think. We'll see you next week.